Hello, everybody. My name is Randall Halle. I'm the director of the European Studies Center, and I'm happy to welcome you to the last in our Conversations on Europe, our monthly session discussing various topics on the EU, on Europe in general. This is the last one, and as you know, the year that we're looking at is a year of consequential elections, not just in the United States in November, but already in June, June 6th through 9th, we have consequential elections in Europe. And I would, I'll turn over the conversation in a moment to the panel, but I also want to point forward to this. After our conversation next year, the Conversations in Europe will be returning in August to focus on sustainability. But also then we'll be having kind of wrap-up sessions focused on the state of democracy in Europe. And so with that, let me actually turn the session over to the guest moderator this month. And there couldn't be a better person here at the University of Pittsburgh. Jae-Jae Spoon is both professor of political science and also chair of the political science department, and was before me, the director of the European Studies Center. Jae-Jae is a specialist, especially on elections, electoral policy, electoral and party politics, and especially the EU. So we couldn't be in better hands to have someone guide us through that conversation. And with that, Jae-Jae, I'm happy to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Randall. Appreciate it. And I want to welcome all of my colleagues who are joining me today for the discussion, and to our virtual audience as well. And today, my colleague, Zeynep Somer-Topcu, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Government at UT Austin, will also be joining me in co-moderating today's discussion. Before turning to the panelists and introducing them and giving them all a chance to give some introductory comments, I'd like to first provide some background on the upcoming elections. As Randall said, on June 6th through 9th, citizens across the 27 member states of the European Union will be voting on their representatives to the European Parliament, which importantly is the only directly elected body in the European Union, which represents nearly 450 million people. This will be the 10th election since direct elections were instituted in 1979, and the first election since Brexit. And elections are held every 5 years. So the last election across the EU was in 2019. Elections are conducted via proportional representation in all member states for the 705 members of the European Parliament, or MEPs, which is an acronym that you'll be hearing about more in today's discussion. National parties run in their respective countries under their party names and come together to form what are called European party groups, which we'll also be hearing more about today. The European People's Party, a group of ideologically conservative and Christian democratic parties, currently holds the majority of seats in the EP. The party's leader is Ursula von der Leyen from the German Christian Democrats, or CDU, and in her role as the leader of the largest party in the EP, she also serves as the president of the European Commission, which is the executive branch of the EU. And something we're going to be talking a lot about today are parties and elections, the upcoming elections and polls. But to give just a quick background, and then we'll be hearing more about this, recent polls are showing that the group of far-right parties, and that group is called the Identity and Democracy Party within in the European Parliament, is gaining considerably, as it is in many countries across the EU domestically. Some of the parties that are in this group include the Freedom Party of Austria, the Rassemblement National in France, the Vlaams-Belang in Belgium, the AFD in Germany, among others. In addition, the European Conservatives and Reformists is also gaining in the polls. And this party group includes the Brothers of Italy, party of Giorgia Meloni, the Sweden Democrats, Vox, to name a few. And recent projections that we'll be hearing more about show that these two groups are up in the polls and will likely be gaining seats in the upcoming elections. And we'll hear more from our panelists about why this matters and if there should be concern for this. And in several countries, including France, the Netherlands, Italy, Sweden, Hungary, and Poland, members of these groups are polling either in first or second place. And again, we'll be hearing more about that. To start, I've asked each of our panelists to provide a brief overview of the upcoming elections, of various issues, parties, etc. And we're going to start with Catherine DeVries, who is the Generali Endowed Chair in European Politics and Professor of Political Science at Bocconi University in Milan. She's also the Dean of International Affairs and co-chair of the International Advisory Council of Bocconi University. Her scholarship focuses on the interplay between domestic and international politics, with a geographical focus on the European continent and the EU. She's interested in understanding global challenges, such as opposition towards international cooperation, the rise of populism in the far right, political fragmentation, migration, and corruption. Among her most recent publications is a co-edited special issue in the journal European Union Politics, titled Differentiated Integration in the European Union. Catherine?
Thank you so much, JJ. Thank you also so much to Zeynep and the other Kai and Jan, who will be introduced. I'm by first name, sorry. I know these people very well, but I'm very happy to be here today and to talk to this audience. I'm just going to try to, let me see if this works. Try to share some slides, and I have to go to the first slide. I just want to make sure that you can see them. Yeah. Okay, perfect. So I was asked to say a little bit of, and actually following up on JJ already, a little bit about the European parliamentary election and what we can expect in 2024. And it's very clear, so they are already spread out on a couple of days, which is different than in many other electoral contexts, because there are effectively 27 elections that are run in 27 countries. However, parties that are doing well in these individual elections are going to be grouped in the European Parliament in so-called party groups. So that means that indeed, if you're voting for the Brothers of Italy party, which is the party of the Prime Minister in Italy, Giorgia Meloni, you are going to sit indeed in the ECR group, as you see here. If you would vote for the Social Democratic Party in Italy, you will go and sit in the SD group, which is a kind of social democratic party group in the European Parliament. This is the kind of composition of the European Parliament in the last session, so that's now ending as soon as the newly elected parliament is coming into place. And here we see the kind of seat distribution, and what we see is a conglomeration of parties, so different to the United States or different to the United Kingdom, because these elections are fought by proportional representation. We know based on research that often leads to having more parties being represented in Parliament. And that's also what we see in the European Parliament, even though it's coming in that kind of directly way, but they're aggregated over national election platforms in the first stage. So they go here from the left to the right. So those would be Green parties, those would be Social Democratic parties, then also Renew Europe. So one of the big parties that is associated with that party group is the party of Renaissance of the French President Emmanuel Macron. Also the still current Prime Minister Mark Rutte, maybe soon NATO General Secretary, that is of a Dutch kind of more conservative party, a conservative liberal party. Then we have the European People's Party, which is the Christian Democratic, let's say, grouping, which is the party grouping that's actually quite important also to keep an eye out when it comes to the European parliamentary election results, because it's the party grouping of the current Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. And then we have the two groupings that JJ already referred to, which we can call radical right or far right, whatever. And I think Kai is much more an expert on this definitional question. But in the kind of common parlance would be parties that are more on the hard right, i.e. they're not only socially conservative, but they're also clearly anti-immigration and somewhat also maybe anti-establishment. And that would be the parties that are party groupings that are called ECR and ID. And what we even have seen in recent polling, let me see, in recent polling, so this is the polls of Politico. So Politico EU is a website that has always a polls of polls. There's also other polling predictions that are made by Simon Hicks and colleagues at the European Parliament, but they don't differ actually that much. They look at past kind of developments in the European Parliament as well. And turnout, of course, is different sometimes. I'm going to come back to that. But this is what we see basically happening. Well, we see that the European People's Party is going to be stable and actually increasing slightly. We see a slight decrease for the S&D party, but we see kind of a rise in this ID group which is a far-right party grouping that JJ was referring to, and some of the other parties are more stable. Note what we do know, the recent Dutch elections, I'm Dutch by birth, a lot of people are going to change their actual vote choice in the last weeks of the election. So in that way, we need to kind of also, and we see that especially in European parliamentary elections, but it looks like that it might be the right doing much better, either the conservative right or the far right in comparison to previous elections that we've seen. And this is the kind of in the last couple of months. So this issue is also that we have to be a bit careful with polls in the European Parliament, because many people don't turn out in European parliamentary elections or decide on the days close to it not to turn out. So it's always difficult. Remember that in the US context to kind of, predict two things at the same time, party choice and turnout. But what we also know is that actually European parliamentary voters are much more volatile nowadays than they have been in the past. This is just from a kind of post-war period, where we see the total share of electoral volatility. And electoral volatility means, are you as a voter voting for the same party that you were voting for in the last election? And we have grouped that from European parliamentary elections and national elections. European parliamentary elections has always been slightly higher, and that is because they're often seen as less important elections. They're European parliamentary elections, not the primary national elections. So people might vote with less strategic considerations when they vote in European parliamentary elections, but also that what JJ was already referring to, these are fought under often different electoral rules than national elections and much more permissive electoral rules. So they're proportional representation, and they look slightly more like, let's say, the Dutch system, which I'm from. So that leads also to much more kind of volatility and fragmentation within the system. But what we see also is that it's just been more difficult to predict what voters are going to do in an election in general in Europe, but especially in European parliamentary elections. So then to kind of talk a little bit about the issues. So there's been less polling on what the top issues are going to be for voters. And I also want to kind of urge caution. We're not there yet, right? We're still in April. But what we see from a collection of national polls, but also some polls that I've done together with the Bertelsmann Foundation, that's a German foundation which we do regular polling with, it's called EU Opinions, that actually three key issues are top of mind: immigration, the environment, and peace and security. So if you ask people, and peace and security is grouping of things like the Gaza war, Ukraine war, defense, these kind of related issues. So in that way, that's actually quite interesting as an EU scholar, because these have actually been issues that the last Commission has worked very hard on. The Green Deal, it's done all kinds of immigration deals. These usually were done with Northern African states. It's tried to also crack down on immigration. And of course, it's done a lot when it comes to or at least it's done a lot within EU related issues. Most support has still come from the United States, but when it comes to the war in Ukraine. So actually some of the policy priorities of the von der Leyen Commission have also now been translated in the policy priorities of voters. So that makes us think that actually European parliamentary elections, which traditionally were less important elections, were usually about national politics, kind of referendums on national politics, are maybe kind of slightly changing in the sense that might be important, right? Government popularity is going to play a role in the same that it does in the US in gubernatorial elections or in other European countries in regional elections. But there are also a lot of EU-related issues that are now on top of minds for many voters. But we see a little bit maybe still left when we look at turnout results from this model that we usually refer to as a second order model. So European parliamentary elections being very much like gubernatorial elections in the United States or regional elections in Europe, that they're not of top concern for voters, and that they are usually not the kind of elections that voters get the most excited about, right? Which are not the top races about who's going to be the government, who's going to be the president of France, who's going to be the prime minister of Italy, but they're going to European officials are kind of less known. And that's what you see when you compare, for example, the last election, 2019, to the national elections that were held just before or just after the the 2019 European parliamentary election, the only country that has the same level of turnout in European parliamentary elections as national parliamentary elections is Belgium, but Belgium has compulsory votes. So if you don't vote, you get a fine. So that's a kind of slightly different incentive. But what you see across the board is actually much redder, so darker colors on the national parliamentary elections, indicating higher turnout compared to much kind of weaker colors or slightly more orangey colors for European parliamentary elections. So there's still, EU issues are going to probably play a role. So the policies that have been at the European level, which is good news for the European Parliament and how responsive voters might be to it, and also then policymakers, but turnout is likely going to be slightly lower. So just Jan will maybe talk about it, but actually one region in Europe where it's particularly there was Central Eastern Europe. For example, the last European parliamentary elections, it was just above 20% in Slovakia, right? So this is quite low when you come to voter participation. Then the last thing I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to hand over to the other panelists, is what will this result mean? So I think one thing is important. Yes, definitely the European parliamentary elections. Sorry, I just kind of, as a teacher, kind of put a graph here that gives you the two electoral connections from voters into the European into EU politics. You have basically two electoral connections: the direct election in the way that JJ was outlining, so voters can elect national political parties that are going to be associated with European parliamentary list, determine the European Parliament composition. But you also have European voters voting for national elections that have their national governments and that determine basically the prime ministers and the ministers that are either going to be in the European councils, where the ministers jointly decide on the long-term policy of the European Union, or in the Council of Ministers, which basically is where ministers of a particular leaning, let's say agriculture, immigration, finance, etc., will sit together and determine. So the European parliamentary elections only, let's say, determine half of what's going on in the European Parliament, and that's in the EU, and that's usually things that we call that have to do with ordinary legislation of the European Union. So what the European Union is doing on a day-to-day, but key issues like should we enlarge with Ukraine, or should we sanction Russia in the future, or what should we do with Gaza, are much more long-term developments and are usually decided via national elections, via people who then jointly sit together in the European Council. So many of these key questions will actually not be necessarily determined by the European parliamentary election. But the European parliamentary election is also super important in the short term when it comes to the confirmation of the Commission. So the way the government, let's say, works in the European Union is that the national governments decide on a team in the same way that a president will determine a team in the United States. And then that team will be representatives of the 27 member states that are going to be commissioners on a particular field, from enlargement to the single market to immigration, all kinds of different commissioners. These commissioners will then have a president, that's the head of the European Commission, and both the Commission and the president together need to find approval in the European Parliament. So that is where the key, the changes in the European Parliament that will move away probably from the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats that we've seen in the past, maybe with the Liberals, towards more the far right, might have a real determination on who becomes a commissioner and who becomes the Commission president. And Ursula von der Leyen has fully understood this. She's very good friends with, for example, Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister in Italy, which is the biggest group within the ECR, right? Which is basically because the Berlusconi's party, which used to be the party in her party group, is not so electorally important anymore. So you'll see a lot of wheeling and dealing when it comes to the short term on the confirmation of the Commission as such, but also the Commission president. And then the long term, and that's what I'm going to end on. So you have this kind of grand coalition of Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, and liberals in the European Union. So if you want to think about it, these would be centrist politicians. That would be kind of, let's say, the difference between MAGA Republicans and the, let's say, Bush Republicans, right? So that are more centrist in some ways. And what we'll see also in the European Parliament, that it will be much more difficult to keep that centrist coalition together because they're going to just be much smaller. You saw it already in the last election that the Greens were bigger. Now you're going to see the far right bigger. So we will also, for the long term, it might affect policy in the sense that policy will be less, will be maybe more beholden by more extreme sanctions within the European Parliament. But we always have to remember that that's only one part of what the EU decides on, which is like normal legislation and not necessarily the long-term view of the European Union. So this is what I wanted to say in a kind of bird's eye view, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you so much.
Great, Catherine. Thank you so much. Lots of great information and lots of things I've noted down to circle back to when we get to the discussion. I want to turn now to Kai Arzheimer, who is professor of political science at the University of Mainz in Germany. Kai's research focuses on political behavior in Europe, and in particular on the politics of the far right and voters and political extremism. And he's one of the, I should say, big experts on the field in the European context. And one of his, I think one of his contributions that he's made to the field of far right politics is collecting this incredible bibliography of work on the far right, the extreme right, the radical right, which he will of course tell us about the terminology that is available for everyone to consult. So that's a wonderful resource. And among his most recent publications is a co-authored article entitled "Place Does Matter for the Populist Radical Right Sentiment, but How? Evidence from Germany." So Kai, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here, if only virtual. You asked me to give a brief overview of the far right and its role in the upcoming European elections. Now, I would indeed like to start with the definition or an attempt to define the far right. In my view, the far right is basically a convenient shorthand to talk about three different groups of parties. And the first has been called the extreme right, sometimes even the neo-fascist right in the past. And these are parties who are openly anti-democratic, who want to go back to the 1930s, want to abolish democracy, basically. And they play a very minor role in most European countries, thankfully. But groups like the NPD in Germany or the Golden Dawn in Greece come to mind. So they do exist, but they're pretty much at the fringes. The bigger group, the more relevant group within this far-right grouping is the so-called radical right. And these are parties, sometimes also called the hard right, which are not openly opposed to democracy as such. Some of them even claim to champion a true kind of democracy, a more direct democracy, a democracy for the silent majority. What unites them, what sets them apart from more mainstream parties is that they're pretty illiberal. So they're highly critical of the media, the courts, all other parties. They want to abolish minority rights. Sometimes they have a pretty authoritarian streak, and they have been very successful over the last 2 or 3 decades in many European countries. So I think basically any European country, there is now a radical right party, and quite often they have become more successful over the past, as I said, 2 decades perhaps. A third group of parties that often goes under this far-right shorthand is called radicalized mainstream parties. So these are former conservative, Christian democratic, or even liberal parties that took several pages out of the radical right's playbook. Basically, they started to emulate radical right parties. And one rather prominent example is Fidesz in Hungary, so Viktor Orban's party, which started out as a conservative liberal outfit originally, and then became pretty authoritarian in its approach to managing democracy. But also the Austrian Christian Democrats have toyed with this idea to become a sort of copy of the Freedom Party in their own country. What unites these parties, what binds them together really is nativism. That is a somewhat paranoid or at least xenophobic brand of nationalism, which holds that elements which are not native to a given country or society are dangerous, basically. This is not completely identical with old-style racism, but is more like a modernized, more cultural brand of racism. And all these parties focus, as you already mentioned, on immigration, but also on multiculturalism. That is the relationship between different cultural and ethnic groups within European societies. Quite often they're also skeptical of the European Union, although there's quite a range of positions when it comes to European culture, European institutions. And more recently, they have latched on a whole host of secondary cultural issues or issues that are framed as cultural, most prominently perhaps climate change and measures to mitigate climate change, but also other environmental issues, questions of gender, transphobia, all that stuff, which goes under the label of culture wars. This is, as I said, like a secondary set of issues for these parties. Most recently, they have also engaged with Russia's war against Ukraine. Many of these parties have rather friendly ties with the Kremlin and are taking a stance which is sometimes openly pro-Russian, sometimes they are just speaking as ambassadors of peace and want moderation and whatnot. Some of them, and most prominently Meloni's Fratelli, on the other hand, supporting Ukraine. So this is a bit of a divisive issue for the far right. But in most countries, they try to benefit from this conflict by playing a slightly more pro-Russian tune. And Catherine has already told us about the groups in the European Parliament, the ECR and the ID groups. And I would subsume both of these groups under the far right label, which is perhaps a bit unfair towards some parties within the ECR. But by and large, you could say these two groups represent the far right in the European Parliament. Now, talking about the surge or the supposed surge of the far right, the ECR and ID combined hold 18% of the seats in the current parliament. And probably if all these models hold, this could go up to 25%. This is not exactly a takeover of the European Union by the far right, but is quite impressive. If they can gain 7, 8 additional percentage points, that would make them one of the largest parties if you would combine them, which is probably not going to happen in the near future, but we can talk about that later. But collectively, they would make up perhaps a quarter of all the MEPs, all the members in the European Parliament. And that would, of course, shift the balance of power in the way that you've already mentioned, Catherine. So why this increase? Why this, not exactly a surge, but why this increase in the voting power of the far right? We've already touched upon this idea that European elections are second-order elections, so that they are shaped more or less by national political actors, national political issues, and national developments, if you will. And the issue of immigration has become more important in most European countries over time. This has been accelerated perhaps by the war of Russia against Ukraine, which brought very high numbers of refugees in some European countries, for instance, Poland, but also Moldova. Germany comes to mind, which also accepted a very large number of Ukrainian refugees. And this has brought immigration back on the agenda in many countries. You've already mentioned the deals that the European Union is doing, but it's important to notice that the effect of immigration on the far right vote is not so much linked to the actual numbers, to, if you wish, objective figures. It's more about the salience of the issue, and immigration is back with a vengeance, no matter what the European Union is doing and what national governments are doing in this domain. So 5 years ago in the 2019 election, we had a bit of a green wave or green progressive wave. And this wave is slightly receding. And on the other hand, in many European societies, there is an increased focus on immigration and other issues linked to the cultural right or the cultural far right. Now, I could go on about this for ages, but I have to stop soon. One point I would like to make is that the European member states, the 27 member states of the European Union, are not equally represented in the European Parliament. So the bigger member states get more seats, not proportionally more seats, but still more seats. And the four most populous member states, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, collectively hold almost half of all the seats in the European Parliament. And if you look at the national politics of these four countries, in turn, you get at least a partial explanation for that increase in the far right's voting power. So in Germany, the AfD, the most important radical right party in Germany, is set to double its vote share roundabout, which is, of course, because, as I said, immigration is back on the agenda in Germany big time, but also because the AfD represents the pro-Russian or at least Ukraine skeptic sentiment that some Germans hold. And so in national polls, they have gone from around about 12% to more than 20% in recent months. And this is probably or will probably be reflected in their vote share in the upcoming European election. In France, the National Rally is also expecting strong gains compared to 2019, and this is in line with a long-term trend in French politics. In recent polling, National Rally is indeed the strongest party in France. They're expected to win round about 1/3 of the French seats in the European Parliament. They're riding on the wave of skepticism about immigration, multiculturalism, and so on and so forth. I think they're also benefiting quite a lot from the almost collapse of the old party system and of Marine Le Pen's long-term strategy of demonization of her party. So she's making her party look more and more harmless. And that's a project she has been pursued since she took over the party from her father. Italy is an interesting case because Giorgia Meloni is an actual prime minister from the far right. You would not necessarily notice this because she's remarkably moderate in her public statements, but she is from Fratelli, which is a far right party, and she's heading a government which comprises of the Fratelli, the Lega, another radical right party, and Forza Italia, Berlusconi's old party, which is usually classified as conservative or right-wing populist, but is, I think, not so much different from the other two parties in the cabinet. And indeed, Italy has been a lab almost, or testing ground for the normalization, for the mainstreaming of the far right since the 1990s. Looking at the polls, Lega is going to lose half their seats or almost half their seats. On the other hand, Fratelli is probably going to double their seats. So there is a shift within this coalition, which is interesting because it also translates into a shift between the ID party and the ECR party in the European Parliament. And in the latest projection that I have seen, there are even some wins for Forza on the cards, but I'm not quite sure about that. Finally, Spain. Spain is interesting because for a very long time, there has been no viable radical right party in Spain. You had a lot of very small fringe parties, classic old style extreme right parties. But this is over now. Spain, as one of the last holdouts, has also succumbed to this radical right wave, and Vox is probably going to double their share in their vote share in the European election. Still, that's not a huge gain as such, but it does count. Finally, the fifth most populous state in the European Union is, I think, Poland. And here we have projected losses for PIS. So they and their allies are probably going to lose seats in the upcoming European elections. So another sign or another piece of evidence that there is no uniform shift to the far right, but the far right will become more important in the new European Parliament. And at the same time, we have this tendency to normalize the far right, to accept their positions into the mainstream in many countries. And we've already heard about the very good relationship between Ursula von der Leyen and Giorgia Meloni. I've even heard talk about a future move that could see the Fratelli admitted to the European People's Party, but I'm not seeing this in the near future. But the fact alone that we're talking about such possibilities shows that the European People's Party, so the center-right parties, is trying to factor in these developments on the far right. And that's it from me for now.
Great, thank you, Kai. Lots of great information as well, and of course, lots more to discuss that we'll come back to. So our final panelist, although certainly not least, is Jan Rovny, who is professor of political science at the Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics at Sciences Po in Paris. His research focuses on political competition in Europe from both the parties and the voters' perspectives, and he's also interested in the impact of voters' characteristics, such as their ethnicity, on their political attitudes and voting behavior, as well as the forms of their political representation. His most recent book, Circumstantial Liberals, Ethnic Minorities, Political Competition, and Democracy, is forthcoming with Oxford University Press. Jan.
Great, thank you very much, JJ and Zeynep, for having me. It's a pleasure to discuss with friends. So I was asked to talk a little bit about Central and Eastern Europe and the context of these European elections for Central and Eastern Europe. I think I'm going to turn the tables a little bit. Central and Eastern Europe is often, the afterthought. We kind of talk about the West, and then when time permits, we talk about the East. And I'm going to try to suggest that actually the East is the foremost playground of what is going on in Europe. And if we want to understand Western European politics, we should study Eastern Europe, because Eastern Europe is actually showing the path of where Western Europe is headed in many ways. And I'm going to suggest 4 of these today and hope to discuss this with you. So in 4 ways, Eastern Europe is ahead of the West and the West is following. And unfortunately, normatively, these are not very good ways in which Eastern Europe is ahead. The first one in which is ahead is the competition over the order of society. And it's already been mentioned that there is increasing contest over the extent to which we actually want to live in a liberal democracy and the extent to which we want to live in an open trading market system, such as is embodied by the European Union, which is primarily an organization which facilitates the movement of people, capital, goods, services, right? And so this competition between what we have known in the post-war period as basically the liberal democratic model and this new form of illiberal government based on some kind of nativist or ethnically defined sense of who people are is profoundly at stake in most Eastern European countries and capitals, and will play out very deeply in the context of these European elections. So you probably all know that Hungary is lost. Hungary has now been in the grips of the Fidesz party that Kai has discussed, a party that has gone from being kind of a pseudo-liberal party, but relatively quickly turning to a conservative and then effectively a radical right party. It has changed the constitution of Hungary a number of times. It has altered its electoral laws. It has outlawed the media. It has even kicked out universities. It has really turned into a system that we would not imagine possible inside modern Europe and inside the European Union. Although Hungary is lost, there still remains an opposition, and so there is a contest between this vision in Hungary. Poland, on the other hand, also, as Kai has mentioned, actually went back. So Poland recently saw an election that returned the pro-democratic center-right forces and taken power away from the illiberal populist PIS party. This will play out interestingly in the European Parliament elections, as we do expect that the PIS party will lose seats and the democratic coalition parties will gain. If you have followed recent news, you know that Slovakia has gone off the cliff. The election this weekend has confirmed that not only the illiberal party of Prime Minister Fico controls the parliament and the government, there is also now a president who's effectively a friend and old-time colleague of that prime minister, and therefore there really are no more checks and balances apart from the constitutional court, and let's see how that goes. So we expect, unfortunately, that Slovakia will probably follow the path of Hungary, and time will tell the extent to which various actors, particularly the courts and media, will be able to check this in the long run. The Czech Republic is in the balance. There is currently a democratic coalition, although very interestingly, the leading party of this democratic coalition is sitting together with the ECR group, which you all refer to as a radical right group now. I certainly agree. It's a very funny situation for this government party to be in. So there is a big tension over where the Czech Republic will go in the long run. But As Kai has very nicely discussed, all of these developments are happening in the West. They're happening slower. They're less advanced. But in the United States, let's see what happens. But the situation is similarly dire as we have seen prior to the election in Slovakia, I would argue. In France, we are in a very similar position. In Italy, we're in a similar position. As Kai has mentioned, radical right parties that are questioning the liberal democratic order are either first or second in France, Germany, Italy, Austria, Belgium, Netherlands, and Sweden, right? So half of Europe, half of Western Europe is effectively in a approaching a similar position as the East. So first warning. Second warning, the end of the moderate left. There are very few today, and generally only smaller moderate left parties in Central and Eastern Europe, right? They exist in places like Hungary and Poland. They are systematically a part of the democratic coalitions, but they are very small. They will not poll more than 10% if they're lucky. In Slovakia, the left-wing party is the party of Fico, but we can't really, I mean, they're not a moderate left-wing party. They're really now an illiberal populist political party. Now, this is foreshadowing, I would argue, very similar trends that we see, particularly in some Western European countries. In France, the left is, I don't want to say dead. They have just recently, this weekend, they have polled at 10% for the European elections. That would be an amazing victory for them if they manage to get 10%. But we're talking about the French Parti Socialiste. And if you imagine the French Parti Socialiste, which has been the major political party of the French system over the course of the post-war period, getting 10% and being happy with that, it means that they're effectively dead. In Germany, the SPD is in government, but it's slowly heading towards the floor, and I suspect it's their last government for quite a while. So the left is in a slightly different position in Southern and Northern Europe for a number of very specific reasons. In Northern Europe, it seems to be particularly in cases like Denmark, where the left has embraced anti-immigration rhetoric to a certain degree, that they're able to maintain their electoral turnout. So the end of the moderate left is another lesson that the East has shown and that the West is following. The third, and this really goes very directly into the work and research of Catherine, is the collapse of party organization and the cycling of challenger parties, right? Eastern Europe is very famous for being volatile, for being sort of ideologically unspecified, being very personalistic in terms of its political parties. It's a bit of a caricature. There actually are quite a lot of important social structures. There are actually a number of parties that have survived for quite a long time, some of them, in fact, even for centuries. But overall, of course, Central and Eastern Europe has been much, much more volatile. So this is well known. But let's look at the West. I mean, I live in France now. The striking thing is that France is an incredibly volatile political system right now, right? So the governing party, Emmanuel Macron's now called Renaissance, they changed their name. They changed their name, right? So they're so volatile that they changed their names. The name prior to that was En Marche, which actually is a play on the initials of Emmanuel Macron, EM, right? That is a personalistic party if you've seen one. In Germany, we now have the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, right? So another very clearly personalistic political party. We have new parties breaking through left and right in Western Europe, like, for example, the Farmers in Netherlands. They're going down in the polls, but they have exploded in the last national election, which is quite interesting. The striking thing, and I want you to sit with this, is that the most structured and the party with the deepest history now in France is the Rassemblement National. That is the most established party in the French system, right? This is where we are. So it strikes me that especially some countries in Western Europe are slowly heading east. And I've written a little blog post about how France is effectively an Eastern European country. Some colleagues did not like that, but that's all right. My final point, my final warning is that geopolitical orientation is becoming a fundamental component of political competition. It has, of course, become extremely salient, primarily for Eastern Europeans in the context of Russia's attack on Ukraine, the second one in 2022. In this context, countries that are close to Russia, physically, geographically. And these countries also happen to be countries that were invaded by Russia once or twice in the last 60, 70 years. They're very keenly aware of how potentially highly problematic this could be. So there was a strong, at first, strong sense of unity in support of Ukraine and opposition to the Russian invasion. But slowly this has given way to differentiation that Kai has already mentioned, right? Where particularly those who oppose the liberal democratic order are much more likely to have closer ties with the Kremlin. Many of them are financed by the Kremlin or have been financed by the Kremlin. And they are now looking for different ways to engage with this particular situation and kind of soften their views on Russia. We see that on the one hand, the West has been behind in understanding the level of threat that the situation poses for the entire continent. But similarly, a number of Western European countries are seeing this divide over geopolitical orientation appear, particularly among the radical right that tends to be more Russia-friendly and the mainstream parties that tend to be more aware of what is happening in the East. But it's not just the radical right. Very interestingly, there is an interesting tension now between Macron, who is taking increasingly a more hawkish position on Russia, and the French left, which is still kind of having their crazy dream about the Soviet Union that is a little hard to understand for someone who has grown up in Prague. So these are just 4 points I wanted to suggest in which I think that Eastern Europe is actually a playground showing how Western Europe might turn out in the next couple of years. There will be more competition over liberal versus illiberal orientation of countries. There will be continuing decline of moderate left, potentially moderated by some specific regional effects. There will be decline of traditional parties and cycling of more or less radical challengers. And there will be increasing competition over geopolitical orientation, and particularly how do we engage or contain or not Russia and potentially China. So where Eastern Europe is, the West will follow. Please study the East. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan. I feel like I played into this, which was not my intention, which was should have had you go first, and then Catherine could have explained everything, or had you do it. So, but thank you very much. Very wonderful points. Okay, so we have lots of things to discuss, and of course we could probably have this discussion continue for many hours, which we will not, since all of my colleagues in Europe is already 7:20 in the evening. I'm going to turn it over to Zeynep, and we're going to start some discussion. For those in the audience, of which we have a wonderful audience, at least in terms of numbers today, I'm sure you're also wonderful qualitatively too. As you think of questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll try and get to as many as we can, but just feel free to pop them in as they come to you. So I will turn it over to Zeynep.
Thank you. This was great. I learned so much. Thank you very much to all the panelists. And the question that I want to start with is also on far right, because, you know, when we look at the coverage of European elections in the media among the pundits, we see that the most important issue that's being discussed is this rise of far right politics, which also incidentally was the case back in 2014. Also 2019, when we had these European parliamentary elections, people were like, oh, what's happening? Far right is coming. They are going to take over, which didn't really happen, right? So, I mean, yes, over time, we know far right has been normalized. And, you know, in many countries, they are either the largest party or in the government or top two. And we see, as you said, it's likely that they are going to increase their seats in the European Parliament as well in these elections. But at the same time, the projections suggest that at most, as Kai said, at most it's going to be about 25%. And it's likely that center-right is still going to hold on to its to the largest seat share, not the majority, of course, but to the largest seat share. So what I want to ask all of you is, should we be concerned? In which directions we should be concerned? Maybe starting with Catherine. Catherine mentioned that in the long term, we may be seeing a policy-wise EU moving away from centrist politics towards more right-wing. Is this what you expect what's going to happen. And then Kai, maybe you can talk about the divisions in the far right as you started your talk. The far right winning doesn't necessarily mean there's one policy that they are going to follow through. What would it mean for European Union in terms of policy? And similarly for Jan, what does it mean for specifically for Ukraine and Russia politics, the far right winning or increasing its support?
Yeah, thank you so much, Zeynep. I do agree. It's like the $1,000,000 question. And if I talk to any from the Aftenposten in Sweden to El País in Spain to whatever, The Guardian, it's always the question about the far right. So I think it's really the $1,000,000 question. So if you plot it, I didn't have it in there, but if you plot it, you do see that in compared to national elections, where we see far right in Western Europe or in Eastern Europe, kind of increasing, but then decreasing a little bit again, increasing again, even though in some countries there's kind of an overall increase. But I'd say we already talked about it. Italy had a breakthrough much earlier. Some other countries like Denmark had breakthroughs earlier. Switzerland had breakthroughs earlier, etc. But you do see an increase. So if you would get the slope of that line, it is positive, right? In European elections more than in national elections. And the reason for that is that there are some concerns in domestic elections about the ability of far-right politicians to govern well. In the same discussion that we're having about Donald Trump, is he actually a good, is he actually a good politician or not? It's very different already today. Meloni, as Kai was saying, Giorgia Meloni, it's the country in which I reside, has been, maybe also the expectations are not as high, but like the expectations were that she would be more radical than she is. And actually, she's a very effective rhetorical politician, and she knows her way around. And she was, of course, already a junior minister. Let's not forget that in a Berlusconi government. But like she knows her party is much more of a complex coalition of people in it, right? So in that way, we are different in the sense that some of these parties are now in government at the national level. So I think this concern that there was about their ability to govern has maybe decreased a little bit and might give people now the sense, okay, we can vote for it. The other element is basically that in the European Parliament, actually, when you look at the far right party groups, they have not, to be really honest, there's a lot of research on that, shown up a lot in sessions in the European Parliament, neither prepared a lot of policy, neither they've actually been disproportionately affected by corruption scandals in terms of misusing funds. I mean, actually, Marine Le Pen, the leader of Rassemblement National in France, is still facing this at the national level, and go more. So there are some concerns about their governability at the European parliamentary level. But I think that is not the way voters always think about European parliamentary elections. They think about it as, oh, I'm upset with the government. Oh, I would like to have less immigration. Oh, well, a far-right party might be an option for me. Then the only caveat I would like to see, so in that way, on the basis of what I said, you would predict higher far right, like you would predict the slope of this line to increase. But one little caveat I want to say, and then I hand it over to Kai, is basically turnout is so difficult to predict for the European Parliament. And we saw a slight increase in turnout in 2019 that Jae-Jae is absolutely right. This is the first formal post-Brexit election, but of course we had a post-referendum election in 2019, and there was kind of an increase in turnout, and people were attributing this to like the EU being more in the news and so on. And I've done a recent survey with Badesman that's forthcoming, that like now 75% of people in Europe are able, out of a list, to correctly identify von der Leyen as the Commission president, where under the time of Juncker, for those of you not, we were talking about the Liechtenstein, but this is the Luxembourg prime minister previously, that only 40% of Europeans were able to do that. So they know much more about this. So it could be that we get an equal amount of turnout now than we had in the past. But if turnout is low because of people being more dissatisfied, that tends to hurt the far right. So I think it's just, that's why I said, I mean, the last thing maybe is that, like, for example, Geert Wilders, that won in the Dutch election disproportionately more votes than anyone expected, who's an electoral specialist in the Netherlands, that increase came from the last 7 days of the campaign. So it's very, very difficult to kind of predict what's going to happen. So my first inclination will be, yes, I think there will be an increase in the far right. What that then mean to policy, Kai and Jan can discuss. But there's some caveats. That's turnout, and that's the fact that a lot of things can change in the European Parliament in the kind of short term. But I think this increase of the far right that we've seen in recently is because if they start entering government, they are maybe some concerns about their ability to govern have kind of decreased a little bit. Even we might think it's not the optimal form of government or so on, right? I mean, but I think for many people, that's not so much a concern that it was, let's say, in the 1990s or in the early 2000s. And I think that's maybe also what's changed. So those would be my 2 cents on it.
I think that was more like $2. All excellent points. I don't have anything to add to that. But Zeynep, you asked about cooperation or tensions within the radical right or the far right in the European Parliament. And my very bold prediction is many of them. First and foremost, there will be 2 groups in the European Parliament. There is no talk at all about merging the 2 groups, which would be way more effective, you should think, to have them all united under one banner. It's not going to happen. If we think 10, perhaps 15 years back, there were, I think, even bigger tensions in the European Parliament between Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans, people from the Netherlands and from Germany, because these are, at least some of them are bloody racists, and these are foreigners they're forced to work with. And I think that has worked in favor of liberal democracy in the European Union for a long time. But having said that, they're much more professional than they used to be 10 or 15 years ago. And not just on the national level, but also at the European level. Of course, they still have poor attendance records and all that, and very, very strange characters within some parties, but also very, very competent political operators, Meloni. But also Orban. Orban has been kicked out finally out of the European People's Party. He's probably going to change the ECR, the ECR by joining the ECR. That man has ideas and he has routine. He has a playbook, and so I'm not too relaxed. As I said, it's probably going to be a quarter of the MEPs. This is not going to bring the European Union to a standstill, but combined with the fact that far-right politicians now sit on the European Council, this is still a slightly scary prospect, in my view. That's it from me for now.
Yeah, thanks. I will just add a few words to this idea, exactly as Kai said, right? The radical right had a very hard time working with each other because imagine a Slovak nationalist and a Hungarian nationalist in the same room. 20 years ago, that would have gone to fisticuffs. Today, because of nativism and because of extra-European immigration that hasn't really arrived to Hungary or Slovakia, but that has passed through, they suddenly realize that the outgroup are the Muslims and the Africans, etc., and that Hungarians, after all, are fine because they're white Christians and so, right? So now we have Fico and Orban effectively supporting each other in their campaigns. So that is an important change that has happened, but they still don't like each other on various levels of who's more radical, who's less radical, who's de-diabolized, and who's more diabolic. I mean, if you think of the French example, the de-diabolized person is in the ID and the absolutely diabolical one is in the ECR now. How that will play out, I don't know. Now, the question for me was, should we be worried about the rise of the far right for the armed conflict in Ukraine and the security questions that it engenders for Europe generally? I think we need to be very afraid, but I would actually suggest that the greatest fear and the greatest threat to the Ukraine conflict is going to come in November in the US election. That's absolutely the most critical point. And here, again, a lesson from Eastern Europe. Be aware of second terms. It's the second terms of illiberals that are the most critical ones because they learn from their mistakes. Look at Orban, look at Fico. They have all become fundamentally authoritarian and anti-democratic after they've been in power and after they've lost it. And they've been very determined not to lose it again. So just saying, be aware of who you elect in November, because, I mean, these repercussions will obviously be first felt in Kharkiv and in Kiev, then they will be felt in Poland, but eventually it will be felt in the United States as well, because it's not so bad to have allies and markets in a European Union that is not controlled by Russia.
And on that uplifting note, I want to turn for a moment. We've talked quite a bit about the far right, and of course, can continue discussing that as well. But I want to pick up on a point that Jan made, not only about the moderate left and obviously lessons from Central and Eastern Europe on the moderate left that we're of course also seeing in of course in France and in Germany and elsewhere, but to think to turn a bit to thinking about the far left. And I'm thinking of leaders and parties such as Mélenchon and France Insoumise in France, Podemos in Spain, Die Linke as a few of those examples. But I'd like us to talk a bit about, and maybe I'll start with Jan, since you brought the left up to start, of what should we be thinking about in terms of the far left and these types of parties, both in Central and Eastern Europe and in Western Europe, as those examples that I just gave, and what role are they playing both domestically and potentially in the upcoming elections. And so I'll start with Jan, and then Catherine, if you want to jump in following that.
Yeah, thanks. So the far left has been very interesting because of particularly their regional concentration, right? They have shot to power, particularly in Southern Europe, so specifically in Spain and in Greece in the context of the 2008 financial crisis. And afterwards, right? So Podemos and Syriza were kind of the big radical left parties. They have become much weaker. And in fact, in these countries, it is the major left that has recovered some of these voters and is able to maintain a relatively impressive level of support, particularly in Spain, where it still maintains a government presence. What I think is the most interesting development in the radical left, or the, let's say, deeper left in Europe, is that the list that I've already mentioned, that Sarah Wagenknecht. I'm not sure, she's not probably going to do very well, and Kai can tell us more about this. But what is particularly interesting about her, and what I find very important from a sociological perspective, is the fact that she's fishing in waters that have been deeply neglected, right? And these are waters of economically left-leaning voters who want a state, who want support, who want welfare benefits and so on and so forth, but who are not socially or culturally liberal, who are concerned about migration. These are the types of policies that really were not represented at all in Western Europe, right? Most parties have kind of eschewed these positions, and it was the radical right that kind of walked in there from more economic right-wing positions. And so this is now the first party that is kind of explicitly left-wing, has a left-wing genealogy, but that is actually saying, well, we're opposed to migration. And so how this will stick and how this will potentially encourage other types of formations like this across Europe, I think will be very interesting.
Yeah, I can just maybe, oh, no.
No, you go first, Catherine. You go first.
No, you can. If he was talking about Sarah Wagenknecht, feel free to chime in, Kai. I can do
that very, very briefly. Yeah, there is this literature that says there is a gap. There is a whole position in the European party space which has not been occupied, and Sarah Wagenknecht is doing this now. So I'm looking at this with interest. Right now, she's eating a bit of the AfD's pie, but it's not a very huge chunk yet. Having said that, it's a very new political enterprise, and I think she's just seeing this as a sort of on-ramp to get more publicity, to get more funding, to attract some voters. Her game is really the upcoming regional elections, and then, of course, the national election in Germany. And I think in 2 years' time, we will know whether this is a viable proposition in Germany. My hunch is that her potential voters are so worked up about immigration that they do not care too much about their economical positions. And so perhaps it's not a new winning formula, but right now it's just my impression. And sorry to interrupt you, Catherine.
No, it's absolutely right. I think it related very much to Jan's comment. So I think also in like my other research, which has been very much on parties and stability of parties, more on Western Europe, but there's also great work of Jan, but also Tim Houghton and Kevin Dean-Krause on Eastern Europe, and a lot of those things. I would like to kind of plug those as well. But I think that what you see is basically that you had this period of especially in Southern Europe, where the fallout of Lehman that became ultimately a debt crisis, a sovereign debt crisis in Southern Europe, which was very much associated with their interpretation of parts of the population that the EU and Northern European countries, especially Kai's country and my own country, so Germany and the Netherlands, I think, were seen as unsolidaric with other parts of the European Union, right? And this was seen as a kind of a push against that solidarity and this anti-EU, a new left kind of agenda, which was Syriza in Greece, which was Podemos in Spain, and also later a little bit movement Cinque Stelle in Italy, even though a five-star movement, although it's a bit more difficult to place them on the left-right, but they've become very left now. And I think that what you saw is now I was just checking we always tell students not to do that when we're in a kind of meeting, but I just wanted to check the polls of polls in Greece. So now actually PASOK, so the new version of PASOK, which is the Social Democratic Party, is now polling at the same degree as Syriza. So actually a party that was seen dead, the Social Democratic Party that was seen dead in the debt crisis, now fully come back. Podemos virtually doesn't exist anymore in Spain. You have Sumar, which is the former kind of communists that have, and actually what you see is that the traditional left party, PSOE, the Social Democrats are doing extremely well. In my own country of birth, the Netherlands, we have now a list coalition between the Greens and the Social Democrats. So what's also interesting actually is what you see is that some of these new ideas on the left have actually been also co-opted by the Greens. You saw that in the last election, of course, in Germany. You don't have Green parties in every system in Europe, but like that is also, so there is trouble, let's say, for the left in how it's able to get its issues across. And then the parties that have done kind of well are those that have taken in the issues of challengers from the debt crisis, like in Greece, like in Italy, like in Spain, or parties like the more social democratic parties in Scandinavia, especially Denmark, that have actually started to mobilize anti-immigration stances and anti-Islam stances, to be also honest, for the Danish Social Democratic Party into their own kind of rhetoric. And so taking us, let's say, more lefty and righty kind of position later on. So it'll be interesting to see what happens to Sarah Wagenknecht's initiative moving forward. But I think it's really important. And that's why I think on the last of that, in order when we look forward on this, it'll be very interesting to see what young people are going to do in the 2024 European parliamentary election. We saw it in the Dutch election, the Italian election, the last French election, that actually the far right was doing better than they had done in the past among young voters. So that would also be interesting to watch. But I definitely don't think it's going to look like a great election for a Social Democratic Party group in the European Parliament.
Speaking of the left, let's talk about environmental politics. So we know in several countries in Europe, there have been farmers' protests that have been going on. And environment is not as salient as immigration, is one of the most salient issues as well. And when it comes to European Union, of course, in the realm of European policy. So what I would like to ask you is, where do you see the environmental politics or policy decisions of the European Union going after the election? And particularly, one of the issues of the Green Party group that's been struggling with is that, the German Greens have been losing a lot of support. They were the second largest party in the last European elections from Germany. And now they are down to fourth in the polls, mainly due to probably being the minor coalition partner in the government right now. So with the German Greens going down, the Green Party's group is going to become smaller as well. So where does the Euro environment issue is going to be? What kind of policies do we expect from the next European Parliament? So maybe Kai can talk about the German Greens, and Catherine, if you want to talk about the farmers' protests and environmental policy.
Yeah, it's, I think, not just the German Greens. The German Greens have a particularly cumbersome burden to carry because they're in this coalition. This coalition is terribly unpopular. They're seen by their own voters as selling out. They're seen as a nuisance by everyone else in Germany. So They're losing, but these losses are relatively moderate compared to the current climate in Germany. But more generally, I think this green progressive wave that we have seen in 2019 has been offset by the developments in the East and by concerns about immigration, and also by a framing that sees the transformation of European economies towards a more sustainable, more greener base, if you wish, as something that is costly and a nuisance and contrary to our own way of life and whatnot. So this is something that is hurting green and progressive parties all over Europe, I think, this framing of the transformation as something that is burdensome, at least. Having said that, I think the shrinking or somewhat shrinking Green Party in the European Parliament is one element, but we have to mention again the far right, because of course there is now a serious temptation for conservative and liberal parties to work with the far right in the European Parliament when it comes to scaling down Europe's climate ambitions, for instance. And unlike in many national systems, there is no what they call the Chinese wall or cordon sanitaire, or whatever you want to call it, because politics in the European Parliament is anyways quite fluid and often works across party limits or dividing lines between parties. Also, the European parties are not terribly coherent because they're effectively made up of national parties with diverging interests. So on the one hand, you have a weaker Green Euro party. On the other hand, you have a slightly strengthened far-right Euro party. And I expect that the whole consensus in the European Union is shifting to the right also as far as the environment and the climate is concerned, unfortunately.
Just adding a little bit to that, I think that we have to be very careful. So in Brussels circles, it's always when you say the 2019 European parliamentary election was a pro-EU green wave. Well, if you look at the election results, it's not. So the only kind of consistent set of districts where the Greens were the majority party was in Scotland, which is no longer part of the European Union at the time. So it's not to say that they didn't do well, but that they did so, I think we overinterpret that a little bit. And the reason why is because you don't have like a normal government formation process in the European Parliament, right? Which I explained. You have these two cheers. So the European Parliament has to agree, and then the commissioners have to be put forward. So it was also beneficial for the Commission as an institution to interpret the election result like that, because it had a Green Deal on the shelf that it wanted to do both in terms of economic development, regulation, and so on. That I personally, for full disclosure, think that that's an important thing to do, the green the economy, definitely. But I think it was also in some ways seen by national governments and by some more right-wing parties in the parliament as a quote-unquote competence creep of the European Union, of the Commission, i.e. the Commission going further than it could have, that they think it should have gone on some of these issues. And then I think the issue is not so much that in Europe you see very little climate skepticism or climate denial. It's very little. Most people are fully aware. You see also in Spain, in Italy, I mean, you see a lot of droughts, you saw a lot of floods. I mean, Slovenia had an amazingly devastating flood last year. So I think that is not necessarily the case. But the question now is, am I willing, in many countries you see that, am I willing to change my life for that? And the case in point were indeed these farmer protests in the Netherlands, which already started in 2019. So they started in October 2019, just after the European parliamentary election. They kind of died down on the COVID, and then they kind of increased again. And that was basically, the Netherlands is, just, it's crazy when you think about it, but it's after the US, Argentina and Brazil, the largest agricultural production site in the world. It's tiny. So you have a lot of, especially nitrogen, methane pollution, and it's very close to biodiversity and national habitat. So something really had to change, especially in farming. Mind you, I come from a farming community, and my father was an organic farmer. So he can tell you a lot of stuff that he was not subsidized, where all big farms were subsidized for a long time. That was how the EU policy put forward, and also national policies. Now we're changing that. And of course, all the farmers are really upset, but they've been like basically subsidized for a very long time, and now those subsidies are coming to an end. So it's also a little bit of like, glass half full, half empty. But of course, one can also fully understand that they're very upset about a big policy shift that's going to affect them. And I think the issue that they have been very much in the Dutch case, so what you had basically after a report, that it would be the idea that either you move into different forms of farming, but actually that we would drive down farming in the Netherlands. Note that those farmers that were protesting, only 1% of Dutch GDP is actually done by, let's say, live cattle farmers. What the Netherlands is actually doing is flowers and seeds and like a lot of other things that it's agriculture. But of course, the issue of a farmer that is a hardworking Dutch person that is now being affected by the policy of, that played very much in the hands of, I think Jan already highlighted it, this farmer party that we had in the Netherlands that did exceptionally well, that has a combination of some far-right positions, some populist positions, some farming positions. It's a bit of conglomerate of different things, and they've done very well. And also the other radical right parties in the Dutch system have taken up these issues. This is mainstreamed, right? It was a little bit of a niche thing until basically the end of last year, the beginning of this year, when you saw on Berlaymont, so the square in front of the commission, you saw all trucks from and tractors from every member state. And what you saw is basically, because the mandate is not clearly given via European parliamentary elections, you saw a von der Leyen doing a U-turn in like 7 days, or less than 7 days, actually, right? Or the Dutch government, because she cannot say, I had a mandate for the Green Deal electorally. Well, partly, depending on how you look at the election result, right? She's not elected on that. She didn't campaign on this. So I think the issue is that actually many Europeans, when you ask them, would you want to do that? They would agree. But now that there's some negative effects that are coming out, this is a nice opportunity also for, there is discontent among groups, but also a nice opportunity for challenger parties to fling on and to say, look, this is not going in the right direction. So this is kind of a combination of things that that really is fueling this kind of anti-environment kind of protest that we're seeing. But we have to be very careful not to interpret that as interpreting 2019 as a green wave, and this is an anti-green wave. Because actually, when you look at polling, most Europeans are very committed to doing stuff on climate change. The question is just, how do you organize it? Who pays for it? And how do you compensate potential losers in this? And how do you deal with adaptation versus mitigation? Like a lot of these kind of the devil's in the detail. And I think that's where a lot of it is coming out. But I think the problem is that within the European parliamentary election, the Commission president, it's a very opaque system in how a person gets ultimately the chair of the Commission president, and the person is not really campaigning in the way that a Donald Trump, let's say, or a Biden is campaigning on a policy set, and that gets them into trouble very quickly. So I've just been researching this, so it's like a little bit of on my agenda, especially on farmer protests in the Netherlands. But we have to now be careful not to make the same mistake I think that we did in 2019 to say it's a green wave and now it's an anti-green wave. I think the issue just is that people are supportive even of EU climate policy on a certain condition, but it depends on how it's organized, how it's structured, and where the redistribution of costs are kind of or where the costs land, let's say.
I'm just going to throw one additional thing to this in line with farming, right? And that's the additional thing we have now, we didn't have before, is Ukrainian grain. And the entry of Ukrainian grain into Europe, and particularly Polish farmers who generally have been supportive of Ukraine, are now concerned because Ukraine is the granary of the world. And now it's potentially going to flood some markets in Europe. So that's another dimension of what might be going on. And European generally positions on Ukraine are seen as important here.
Thanks, Jan. And I was just about to say, when you jumped into Catherine's last point, which is what we always say, that context matters, right? We can't just talk about, and I think that's sort of always the challenge in talking about, trends happening across the EU or in European elections, is we want to make, as political scientists, right, sort of grand statements, predictions, but we always have to be very careful, obviously, that about the specifics of what we're talking about. So I am very aware of time, and of course we could continue this conversation for quite a long time, but I do want to just mention again to the audience, if there are any questions, to please quickly type them in. I'd be happy to get to a couple. I've also just popped into the chat for those who might be interested, a couple of links to websites that several of my colleagues have mentioned, to Europe Elects and to Politico. If you are interested in sort of continuing to follow what's happening in the elections over the next couple of months, and polls and projections and issues and things like that, those are two good resources. So while you're thinking of your questions, I want to pose one and start with Jan on voter turnout. Because this is always something that is in the background of course, of all elections, but of European Parliament elections specifically, because these are, as Catherine used the term, what we typically call second order elections, where voters typically vote less, come out less frequently. But where we've seen this, I think, in particular, in this difference between national and European elections, has been in Central and Eastern Europe, where the average turnout since 2004 in every election has been often below 25%. And so I want to turn it over to Jan to perhaps speak a bit about this and some ideas of why this turnout is so low, and kind of what we're thinking may be going on in the election that's coming up as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a classical case of a second order election on the one hand. And secondly, there is a sense in Central Eastern Europe that these countries are small, unable to have their voices heard. So why should they try, right? Just before we started, I went to see the websites of the most kind of significant parliamentary parties in the Czech Republic. Most of them don't say anything about the European Parliament elections. They may have started discussing their lists. They might have some, but the proposals that they make are kind of, almost marginal. So that there really is a sense of, partly because I don't think many of the representatives of the MEPs are not even now, after a relatively long time, right? It's been 20 years that they're in the European Parliament. They're not really accustomed to building the alliances that you need to build. Occasionally someone manages, right? And then tries to sell it, but they're really, very often they come back and they say, look, we're the Czech Republic. What do you expect we're going to get over there, right? We're just 10 million people, and the French were against it. So it's done. So I really think there is this sort of sense of disempowerment because of this. Secondly, based on what I've already said, right, about the volatility of politics in Central and Eastern Europe, there is generally lower sense of trust in politics and in politicians, right? So that's another thing that is a general variable that reduces voter turnout. And if it's already significantly lower in these countries, then you're just going to have much less interest in going to participate in this. So that is sort of my read on why Central Eastern Europe is particularly low.
Catherine or Kai, do you want to add anything on the turnout question, whether in Central and Eastern Europe or more generally?
I think the main issue is really this second order thing, and the fact that European institutions seem opaque, even to Catherine DeVries, who spent a lifetime studying them. So if you translate this to ordinary people who have ordinary lives, many of them are just not that interested in this specific election.
Catherine, any more uplifting words?
No, I mean, I think the thing is that, I mean, we could even be more negative. Like if the European Parliament election is the first election you end up voting in when you are a young scholar, a young person, you're much less likely to vote for the rest of your life. Like there's a lot of like kind of things that are not very uplifting. But I do think that this, I mean, not to say that this election could be different. I mean, what we do see is that the issues that people care about, the name recognition of Ursula von der Leyen, the fact that like you see it earlier on in national arenas, I think now in the media, could be a little bit different. But I just don't think that because of the structural problems that we were talking about, that they just do not determine, let's say, the government of Europe really in the eyes of people. I think it's going to be very difficult for these elections to really speak to people in the way that national elections will.
All right, well, thank you. I feel like we have dumbfounded our audience, or covered everything perhaps in that. We don't seem to have any questions. I hesitate, although I do want to have everyone give a final word, but a quick final word, so we can just sort of do a quick tour if there's anything that has not come up that you want to make sure is mentioned, there's some great resources that folks have been popping in the chat. So please grab those before you sign off because they will disappear. So why don't we start with Jan and then Kai and then Catherine just to kind of close us out.
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to mention, didn't get to, and Kai has actually mentioned this, right? The war in Ukraine has sent millions of refugees to Europe. It has mostly sent refugees to Central and Eastern Europe. And that's very interesting and important because these countries don't generally have a lot of refugees. Some of them are relatively ethnically homogeneous because of cleansing during the Second World War or after it, particularly Poland, Czech Republic. And it's quite interesting to now, come to Prague and to hear Ukrainian spoken routinely on the streets and suddenly, or hear Czech with a Ukrainian accent, which is even more interesting. It's normal to hear English or French or German with an accent, but now to hear Czech or Polish with an accent, that's a new thing. And I mean, some of my research suggests that that's not just going to fuel backlash. It's kind of a glass half empty and a glass half full. It will also fuel heterogeneity and greater tolerance. People will realize they look, there are Ukrainians, they've come here because of this terrible situation. They're working, their children are coming to school, they're learning. And in a way, it actually increases this openness and tolerance to otherness. And my work has shown that this can actually have potentially beneficial outcomes for the support for democracy. So just to end on a positive note, the terrible thing that's happening in Ukraine is not just terrible. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I would like to continue on that positive note because we have talked about the far right and low turnout and rather dubious institutions in Brussels. But the fact remains that the European Union as such is quite successful in terms not just of economic growth, but of creating stability and peace in Europe. And at the end of the day, it's an incredible experiment to have this directly elected multinational and by now quite powerful parliament, and that we have these free elections in the European Union. It's fantastic. And many people like it, even if they do not fully understand it. And that's my positive note for today.
Yeah, and I also I don't know if mine is positive or negative or how you're going to see it, but I do also think that maybe what we could see this is like the normalization of European politics. So what we're seeing in national elections, we're seeing in European parliamentary elections and the other way. So it's not that like if we would have this kind of podcast about the upcoming French election or the upcoming German election or the upcoming Spanish election, it will look very different, right? So in that way, I think, or actually for that matter, if we're talking about American elections that are happening this year or Indian elections that are happening this year, right? So I think in that way, this is also a kind of process that's happening. And I think what is very interesting is to understand what are these big structural changes that are moving people to particular parties that might have quite simple yes/no answers in election results. And then the last thing I also want to say, and that maybe is also sometimes a bit controversial. Yeah, we had cordons sanitaires for a long time, and that might have a lot of benefits to it. But you also see that sometimes when these parties are forced to actually kind of govern together in the way that in the European Parliament and in the European Union, you cannot, it's not a presidential system that you can just determine it by yourself, that sometimes the edges also come off of these parties and they actually start to, integrate. Of course, we've had other exceptions. We've had Fidesz in Hungary, but we also saw Tusk returning into Poland, right? So I do think that what we're seeing is that this is becoming part and parcel of political competition. And this is also maybe something that we should expect, and not always to write alarmist stories in the newspaper that this is going to happen and then give disproportionate attention to these parties when they're in the campaign, but just treat this as also kind of as forces that we have to be worried about, but that they also are kind of part and parcel of competition today.
I think that's a great note to end on. And I'm sorry we didn't have time to talk about more of the issues that are on everyone's minds, but hopefully this was a very informative hour and a half. I know it was for me, and that you will continue to follow developments in the next couple of months before the elections. And thank you to Catherine and Jan and Kai and to Zeynep for co-moderating with me. It's always fun to have a conversation among friends and longtime colleagues, and of course always learn so much from each other. So thank you, and for those in Europe, have a good evening, and those here in the US, have a good afternoon. Take care. Thanks.
Thank you all so much for having me. It was really nice. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a
Bye.
lot.